The sun was setting over a quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the pavement as a young girl walked home from basketball practice. She was wearing her school jersey and had a bright smile on her face, carrying her gym bag over one shoulder. At 16, she was focused on her future, dreaming of making it to college on a sports scholarship. Her dad, a proud and protective man, always reminded her to call him if she ever felt unsafe. But tonight, she didn't think she had a reason to worry. She had taken this route 100 times before. The sound of a police car pulling up behind her broke the silence. She turned, her smile fading as a uniformed officer stepped out. His eyes scanned her up and down with a look that sent a chill down her spine. "Where are you headed, kid?" he asked, his tone cold and sharp. "To my house," she replied politely, trying to hide her discomfort. The officer's expression hardened. "This neighborhood's seen some trouble lately. Got any ID on you?" She hesitated. "I'm just a kid. I don't carry ID with me to practice." That seemed to set him off. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Smart mouth, huh? I got a job to do, and you're looking suspicious walking around here." Her heart started to race. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but she could feel the situation spiraling. She tried to explain, "I live just a few blocks away. My dad is." "Don't care who your dad is," the officer snapped, cutting her off. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. The pain shot through her shoulder as he forced her down to the ground. Tears filled her eyes, not just from the pain but from the humiliation. People in the neighborhood peeked through their windows, but no one came out to help. "I didn't do anything," she cried. The officer ignored her, reaching for his radio. "I got a possible suspect detained," he said, his tone smug. Her mind raced. She thought about her dad, about how he'd always told her to stay calm in situations like this. But as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she couldn't stop the panic from taking over. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, her father was sitting in his home office, finishing up a report. He was a seasoned FBI agent, known for his sharp instincts and unshakable determination. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up without looking, assuming it was a work call. "Hello, Dad," her voice came through, shaky and scared. Instantly, he sat up straighter, his heart dropping. "What's wrong?" I'm in trouble," she stammered. "A cop. He arrested me. I didn't do anything." His blood ran cold. "Where are you?" Before she could answer, the officer snatched the phone from her hand and spoke into it. "This is Officer Turner. Your daughter's being detained for suspicious activity." Her father's voice turned ice cold. "Suspicious activity? She's a high school kid walking home." "Sir, if you've got a problem, you can take it up with the station," the officer replied, clearly enjoying the power trip. The line went dead. For a moment, her dad sat in stunned silence, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, with a deep breath, he stood up, his mind already racing. He wasn't just any father. He was a trained investigator with access to resources that most people could only dream of. And if this officer thought he could treat his daughter this way without consequences, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. He grabbed his car keys and headed out the door, his mind laser-focused. As he drove, his hands tightened around the steering wheel. He had spent years fighting for justice, and now, that fight had hit home. At the station, the young girl sat in a holding cell, her eyes red from crying. The officer smirked at her through the bars, clearly feeling untouchable. "Should have kept your mouth shut, kid," he said, leaning back in his chair, but his smugness wouldn't last long. The front doors burst open, and her father walked in with an air of authority that turned heads. He wasn't wearing his FBI badge yet, but the fire in his eyes made it clear he wasn't here to play games. He approached the front desk, speaking in a calm but firm voice. "I'm here for my daughter. She was wrongfully detained by one of your officers." The desk sergeant looked up, about to brush him off, when the father pulled out his badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice dropping a notch. You might want to rethink how you handle this situation." The surgeon's face paled. "Let me get the officer who brought her in." Within minutes, the smug officer from earlier appeared, his confidence wavering as he saw the man waiting for him. "What's the problem?" the officer asked, trying to sound tough. The father stepped closer, his voice low but filled with menace. "You arrested my daughter without cause, used excessive force, and violated her rights. I've got every word you said recorded from the call you made. You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The officer tried to stammer out a defense, but the father cut him off. "Save it. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky if you're handing out parking tickets in a different state." Behind the scenes, the FBI agent was already pulling strings, contacting his colleagues to escalate the situation. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter's freedom. He was making sure this officer would face the consequences of his actions. The young girl watched from her cell, hope sparking in her chest, as she saw her dad standing tall, unwavering in his fight for her. And in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. You don't mess with a man who's spent his entire life defending justice, especially when his family is on the line. What happens next will leave you speechless. The officer's world is about to come crashing down as the father reveals his full power, ensuring justice is served. Stay tuned for part 2, where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, stood frozen under the piercing glare of the FBI agent. The other officers in the station exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this wasn't going to end well for their colleague. The tension in the room was thick, and the quiet murmur of voices stopped entirely as everyone tuned in to the unfolding drama. The father's presence was commanding, his calm demeanor masking a storm brewing beneath the surface. He glanced at his watch, as if every passing second was a reminder of how much worse this situation could get for the officer. But instead of exploding in anger, he leaned in slightly and spoke with icy precision. "You don't seem to understand the gravity of what you've done," he said. "Detaining an innocent teenager, my daughter, without cause is bad enough. But manhandling her, humiliating her, that's something you'll regret more than you can imagine." The officer swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of those words. "Look, I was just doing my job," he muttered, trying to salvage some dignity. "She fit the description of someone we were looking for." Description. The father's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried more menace than a shout. "She's a kid walking home from practice. No weapons, no threats, nothing suspicious. And you still decided to treat her like a criminal." The officer shifted on his feet, opening his mouth to reply, but the FBI agent raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it. Your excuses don't matter. The facts do." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, the young girl sat quietly, trying to process everything that had happened. The cold metal bench beneath her felt like it might as well have been ice. She'd never been in trouble before, not even a detention at school, and now she was locked up like some kind of criminal. Her mind replayed the moment she was tackled to the ground, the officer's rough hands grabbing her arms, the look on his face that made her feel so powerless. But thinking about her dad gave her some comfort. He'd always told her to stand up for herself and what was right. And now, she realized, he wasn't just saying those things. He was living them. Even though she couldn't hear what was happening in the main office, she had no doubt that her dad was out there fighting for her with everything he had. Back at the front desk, the father turned to the surgeon. "I want my daughter released immediately," he said firmly, "and I want her arrest expunged from the record." The surgeon hesitated. "We'll need to process this through the proper channels," he began, but the FBI agent's sharp look cut him off. "I am the proper channel," the father replied. "And if you don't start moving faster, you'll have federal agents in this station by the end of the hour, asking questions you don't want to answer." The surgeon nodded quickly and picked up the phone, mumbling something about getting the paperwork expedited. As the wheels began to turn, the father leaned against the counter, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. A deep breath later, He hit dial. "Yeah, it's me," he said when the call connected. "We've got a situation. I need a favor." The person on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" "A full background check on an Officer Turner," the father replied. "I want to know everything. His record, complaints, anything that doesn't add up." There was a pause. "You think this guy's dirty?" "I don't think. I know." As he hung up the phone, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. If there was anything questionable about the officer's past, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Minutes later, the holding cell door swung open, and the young girl looked up to see her dad standing there. His expression softened when he saw her, and he stepped inside to kneel down in front of her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. "I'm okay now." He helped her to her feet, the protective arm he placed around her shoulder a silent promise that she wouldn't have to face this alone. As they walked out of the cell, her dad's demeanor shifted back into his professional mode, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the officer. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not by a long shot." The officer didn't respond, but the guilt in his expression spoke volumes. Outside the station, the air felt colder. The father and daughter sat in his car, the engine idling as they tried to process what had just happened. "Dad," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Why did he do that to me? I wasn't doing anything wrong." He sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Some people abuse their power. They think they can get away with it because no one will stand up to them. But they're wrong." She looked at him, her eyes full of questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "What's going to happen now?" "Now," he said, "we make sure this never happens to you, or anyone else, again." As they drove home, the father's phone buzzed. It was a message from the contact he called earlier. He glanced at it briefly, his expression darkening. "Turner's got a history," the message read. "Complaints for excessive force, discrimination, and misconduct. All swept under the rug. Looks like you were right." He clenched his jaw. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them painted a good picture. Later that night, as the young girl tried to sleep, her dad sat in his office, staring at a growing file of information on Officer Turner. The more he read, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about his daughter. Turner had a pattern, and it was only a matter of time before someone got seriously hurt, or worse. The father knew he couldn't let that happen. He had spent his career taking down criminals, and now, he realized, this officer was no different. Turner might wear a badge, but he was abusing his authority, and that made him dangerous. As the clock ticked past midnight, the father leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with plans. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, and he was prepared to go as far as it took to make sure Turner faced the consequences of his actions. What he didn't know was that his investigation would uncover secrets far darker than he had imagined, pulling him into a web of corruption that reached higher than he ever expected. But for now, his focus was clear: protect his daughter and ensure that the man who had wronged her would never have the chance to do it again. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, but the warmth of the light did little to ease the tension in the house. The young girl sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. Though she hadn't taken a sip, she kept glancing at her dad, who was pacing back and forth in the living room, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. She couldn't hear every word, but his tone said enough. He was still working on finding out more about the officer who had arrested her. The man on the other end of the line, an old colleague from the bureau, was filling him in on what he'd uncovered. "It's bad," the colleague said, his voice low. "Turner's got connections to some shady groups. He's been using his badge as a shield for years. Complaints from civilians, cover-ups from inside the department. It's a pattern. And from what I'm seeing, it looks like he's not acting alone." That last part made the father stop in his tracks. "Not acting alone," he repeated, his voice sharpening. "There's more," the colleague continued. "Some of the cases Turner's been involved in. They're tied to bigger players. Corruption at the precinct level. This isn't just one bad cop. It's a whole network. You're stepping into dangerous territory. The father gripped the back of the couch, his mind racing. He had dealt with complex cases before, but this felt different. It was personal now. "Send me everything you've got," he said firmly. "Every detail, every lead." He ended the call and turned to his daughter, who was watching him with wide eyes. "What is it?" she asked hesitantly. He hesitated, not wanting to scare her. "It's more complicated than I thought," he admitted. "But don't worry. I'm going to take care of it." She nodded, trusting him completely, but a part of her couldn't shake the fear that this was far from over. That afternoon, the father drove to the local precinct, determined to dig deeper. He had already filed a formal complaint against Turner, but he knew that wouldn't be enough to get real results. The corruption ran too deep for standard procedures to work. He needed to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. As he walked into the building, heads turned. Word had spread about the confrontation the night before, and officers whispered among themselves as he passed. But he didn't care about their stares. He was there for answers. He went straight to the captain's office and knocked once before pushing the door open. The captain, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked up in surprise. "Agent," the captain said, clearing his throat. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you've heard about what happened last night," the father began, his tone controlled but firm. "Your officer, Turner, arrested my daughter without cause, used excessive force, and violated her rights. And now, I'm finding out he's got a history of misconduct that's been conveniently buried. Care to explain why he's still on your payroll?" The captain leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. "Look, I'm not saying Turner's perfect, but these things are complicated. Complaints come in, investigations get opened, but without solid evidence." "I don't need excuses," the father interrupted. "I need action. And if you can't deliver, I'll take this higher." "Believe me, you don't want that." The captain's face tightened. He could see the determination in the agent's eyes, and he knew this wasn't a fight he could win by brushing things under the rug. "What do you want me to do?" "For starters, I want Turner suspended immediately," the father demanded, "pending a full investigation. And I want access to his personnel file." The captain hesitated, but he finally nodded. "Fine. I'll make the call. But be careful, agent. You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Turner's got friends in high places, and they won't take kindly to someone digging around." "I'm not afraid of hornets," the father replied coldly. That evening, as the father pored over the files the captain had reluctantly handed over, he began to see the full scope of the corruption. Turner wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of a larger operation. Shady deals, falsified reports, and a pattern of targeting specific individuals who didn't fit the image they wanted for the community. His anger simmered as he pieced everything together. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about justice for everyone who had been wronged by Turner and his network. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. He started noticing unmarked cars parked near his house, their occupants watching from the shadows. His phone calls were intercepted, strange clicks and static interrupting his conversations. One night, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest set of documents, the power in the house suddenly went out. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards. He grabbed the gun he kept in his desk drawer and moved quietly through the darkened house, every muscle in his body tense. He found his daughter in her room, her phone lighting up her face as she stared at it nervously. "Dad," she whispered, "what's going on?" "Stay here," he said firmly, closing her door behind him. He made his way to the front door, his heart pounding. As he peered through the peephole, he saw a figure standing just outside, their face obscured by a hood. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. The next morning, he called his colleague from the bureau again. "They're trying to intimidate me," he said. "They think they can scare me into backing down." "Do you want backup?" his colleague asked. "No," he replied firmly. "This is my fight. But I need you to keep digging. Find me something I can use to take them down for good." The tension reached a boiling point when the father received an anonymous tip. The caller, speaking in a low, hurried voice, warned him that Turner and his associates were planning to destroy key evidence that could expose their operation. "They're meeting tonight at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town," the caller said. "If you want to stop them, that's where you need to be." The father didn't waste any time. He prepared carefully, gathering everything he would need to confront Turner and his crew. He knew it was a risk, but he couldn't let them get away with erasing the proof of their crimes. As he drove to the warehouse that night, his mind raced. He didn't know what he would find there or how far Turner and his men would go to protect themselves, but he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. He parked a safe distance away and approached cautiously, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the gravel beneath his boots. Inside, voices echoed through the cavernous space. He crept closer, staying in the shadows, until he could make out the figures gathered around a table covered in papers and electronic equipment. Turner was there, along with several other officers he recognized from the precinct. They were arguing, their voices tense. "This is getting out of hand," one of them said. "That FBI guy's not backing down. We need to shut him up before he ruins everything." The father's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. He stepped into the light, his voice ringing out like a gunshot. "You won't get the chance." The sudden sound of his voice cut through the tense air like a blade, drawing every eye in the warehouse toward him. Turner's expression shifted from shock to rage in an instant, his hands instinctively moving toward his sidearm. The other men, equally startled, exchanged panicked glances, unsure how to react. But the father's steely gaze and unwavering stance made it clear this was not a man to be underestimated. "What the hell are you doing here?" Turner barked, his voice filled with a mix of anger and unease. "You've got no jurisdiction here, Agent. Walk away while you still can." The father took a step closer, his hands held out to show he wasn't armed, though his presence alone was weapon enough. "Funny," he said, his tone ice-cold. "I was about to tell you the same thing. This ends tonight, Turner. No more hiding behind your badge, no more abusing your power. It's over." Turner let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. "You think you can just waltz in here and scare us straight? You're out of your depth, old man. You don't know who you're messing with." The father tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor only adding to the tension. "You're right. I don't know all the players yet, but I know enough to take you down. And if you want to find out just how deep my reach goes, keep playing this game." Turner's crew began to shift uneasily, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. One of the younger officers, clearly less hardened than the rest, spoke up. "Maybe we should just listen to him, Turner. This is getting out of hand." But Turner wasn't having it. "Shut your mouth," he snapped, glaring at the man. "You want to bail? Go ahead. But don't think for a second that you'll come out of this clean." It was then that the father noticed something he hadn't expected. Among the papers scattered on the table was a map, heavily marked with red circles and lines. He couldn't make out all the details, but the names and symbols suggested something much bigger than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about corruption or abuse of power. There was a larger operation at play, one that extended far beyond the precinct. "What's this?" he asked, nodding toward the map. Turner hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm the father's suspicions. "Nothing that concerns you," Turner growled, stepping in front of the table to block his view. "Oh, I think it concerns me plenty," the father replied, his eyes narrowing. "You're not just dirty cops, are you? This is organized. Who's pulling the strings, Turner? Who are you working for?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Turner's jaw tightened, and for a moment, It seemed like he might lash out, but instead he smirked, his confidence returning. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Agent. Even if you knew the truth, it wouldn't matter. You're one man, and you're in way over your head." Before the father could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on concrete. Both he and Turner turned toward the noise, their instincts on high alert. "Did you call for backup?" Turner demanded, his eyes darting around the room. "Not me," the father said evenly, though his heart was pounding. Seconds later, a group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks. They were heavily armed and moved with military precision, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from tense to downright explosive. Turner's men scrambled for their weapons, but the newcomers were faster, their guns trained on everyone in the room. "Nobody move," one of them barked, their voice distorted by a modulator. The father quickly raised his hands, calculating his next move. He didn't know who these people were or what their agenda might be, but one thing was clear: they weren't allies. The leader of the masked group stepped forward, addressing Turner directly. "You've been sloppy," they said, their tone cold and unyielding. "We told you to keep a low profile, and now you've got federal eyes on us. This operation was supposed to stay under the radar." Turner's bravado faltered, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "It's not my fault," he stammered. "He's the one who wouldn't let it go. I can handle this. Just give me more time." "Time's up," the leader replied. "We're shutting this down." The father watched the exchange carefully, piecing together what he could. It was clear now that Turner wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. And whoever these masked operatives were, they had no intention of leaving loose ends. As the tension reached a breaking point, the father decided to act. "If you're shutting this down," he said, addressing the leader, "then you know Turner and his crew aren't the only problem. You've got a bigger mess on your hands than you realize." The leader turned to him, their expression unreadable behind the mask. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who knows how to clean up messes," the father replied, his voice steady. "But I can't do that if you kill everyone in this room. So why don't we try something different?" For a moment, the leader seemed to consider his words. The room was deathly silent, every person holding their breath. Finally, they lowered their weapons slightly, signaling for their team to stand down, but not relax entirely. "Talk," the leader said. The father took a step forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Turner's a small fish. You take him out, someone else will take his place. But if you let me dig, I can get to the source. The real players behind this operation. The ones pulling your strings too." The leader tilted their head, their silence unnerving. "You think you're smarter than us?" they asked. "I think I want the same thing you do," the father replied. "An end to this chaos. But we won't get there if we're fighting each other." The leader didn't respond immediately, but the tension in the room began to shift. Turner, sensing that things were slipping out of his control, made a desperate move, lunging for his gun. The room erupted into chaos. Shots rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The father dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the crossfire. When the dust settled, Turner lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. "Idiot," the leader muttered, motioning for their team to secure the scene. The father emerged cautiously, his heart racing. He locked eyes with the leader, silently daring them to make the next move. "This isn't over," the leader said, their voice low. "You've got one chance to prove you're useful. Don't waste it." As they disappeared into the shadows, leaving chaos in their wake, the father realized just how high the stakes had become. What had started as a fight for his daughter's justice had spiraled into a battle against forces far more dangerous than he'd imagined. And the only way out was to see it through to the end. The warehouse was eerily quiet in the aftermath, the metallic scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air. Turner groaned on the floor, clutching his wounded shoulder, while the other officers stood frozen, unsure whether to run or surrender. The father, steadying his breath, surveyed the scene, his mind racing. The masked operatives had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving chaos in their wake. But he wasn't here for them. His focus returned to Turner, the man at the center of this tangled web. Slowly he approached, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Turner's eyes darted up, wide with fear and pain, but there was still a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "You think you've won," Turner spat, his voice strained. "You've got no idea what you're up against. Then why don't you enlighten me?" The father said, his voice calm but firm. He crouched down, meeting Turner's eyes. "Tell me who's really behind this. You owe me that much." Turner let out a bitter laugh, blood staining his teeth. "You think you're the hero here. You think taking me down will make any difference. You're a fool." The father didn't flinch. He could see the fear behind Turner's bravado, the cracks in his armor. "Maybe I am," he said, "but you're still going to talk." Before Turner could respond, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was on its way. The father stood, his heart pounding. Time was running out, and he needed answers now. One of the younger officers, who had been standing near the edge of the room, suddenly spoke up. "It's bigger than him," he said, his voice shaky. "Turner's just a middleman. The people running this, they're not just cops. They're untouchable." Turner glared at him, but the damage was done. The father turned his attention to the officer, stepping closer. "Who?" he demanded. "Give me a name." The officer hesitated, glancing nervously at Turner, but something in the father's eyes seemed to compel him to speak. "They call him the broker. He controls everything, deals, information, even the precinct. Turner's just his puppet." The father filed the name away, his mind already racing with possibilities. The sirens were closer now, the flashing lights visible through the warehouse's broken windows. He had moments left to decide his next move. Turning back to Turner, he said, "This is your last chance. Tell me where to find him, or I'll make sure you're the first to fall when this all comes crashing down." Turner's face twisted with anger, but there was no fight left in him. With a pained grimace, he muttered, "The docks. Warehouse 17. That's where he operates." It was all the father needed. He turned on his heel, striding toward the exit. But before he left, he paused, looking back at the officers. "If any of you have a shred of decency left, you'll cooperate when the investigation starts. This is your chance to make it right." Without waiting for a response, he disappeared into the night, leaving the chaos behind. The drive to the docks felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew this was it, the final piece of the puzzle. But as he approached Warehouse 17, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. The place was eerily quiet, too quiet, and his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Stepping inside, he found the warehouse seemingly empty, rows of crates and shipping containers casting long shadows under the dim overhead lights. But as he moved deeper into the space, a voice echoed from the darkness. "I was wondering when you'd show up." The father froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon tucked at his side. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in an immaculate suit that seemed out of place in the grimy setting. The man's face was calm, almost smug, as he regarded the father with a chilling smile. "You must be the famous agent," the man continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "I've heard so much about you." "You're the broker," the father said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man inclined his head slightly. "That's one of my many names," he said. "But I must admit, you've caused me quite a bit of trouble. I don't take kindly to that." The father squared his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "This ends tonight," he said. "I'm taking you down." The broker chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. "You think you've won just because you made it this far. You've barely scratched the surface of what I control. Arrest me, kill me. It won't matter. Someone else will take my place, and the game will continue." For a moment, the father hesitated. He knew there was truth in the broker's words, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. "Maybe," he said, "but you won't be around to see it." The broker's smile faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. Before he could respond, the father moved, his reflexes honed from years of training. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the broker's hidden weapon and had him pinned against a crate. But just as he thought he had the upper hand, the broker laughed, a low, unsettling sound. "You really don't understand, do you?" The father frowned, his grip tightening. "What are you talking about?" The broker's eyes gleamed with something close to triumph. "This was never about me. It was about you. All of this, it's been orchestrated to bring you here." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Before he could process them, a sudden commotion erupted behind him. Spinning around, he saw more masked operatives flooding into the warehouse, their weapons trained on him. The broker straightened, brushing off his suit as if nothing had happened. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long," he said. "But don't worry. Your daughter will be well taken care of in your absence." The father's blood ran cold. His mind raced, searching for a way out. The operatives closed in, their movements precise and coordinated. But just as all seemed lost, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse, sending crates flying and plunging the space into chaos. Through the smoke and debris, the father saw a familiar figure, a trusted ally from his past, someone he thought he'd never see again. "Looks like you could use some help," they said, their voice steady despite the chaos around them. The father nodded, a renewed sense of determination surging through him. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and if the broker thought he'd won, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The explosion sent a shockwave through the warehouse, disorienting everyone inside. Smoke billowed, cloaking the room in a haze that made it impossible to see clearly. The father crouched low, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through him. His mysterious ally motioned for him to follow, their movements quick and calculated. They slipped behind a stack of crates, narrowly avoiding a barrage of gunfire from the broker's operatives. "We've got to cut off his escape route," the ally said, their voice urgent. "He'll have a plan to vanish the moment this turns against him." The father nodded, his mind racing. They needed to end this now, before the broker could slip away and regroup. He peered around the edge of the crate, spotting the broker retreating toward a hidden exit on the far side of the warehouse. "Cover me," he said to his ally, determination etched into his face. Without hesitation, the ally laid down suppressive fire, forcing the broker's men to scatter. The father moved quickly, weaving through the chaos and closing the distance between him and his target. The broker reached the exit, fumbling with a concealed keypad, but before he could enter the code, the father was on him. He grabbed the broker by the collar, slamming him against the wall. The man struggled, his composure finally breaking. "You're making a mistake," he snarled. "Taking me down won't change anything." The father didn't flinch. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low and steady. "But it's a start." Behind them, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The ally had called for backup, and soon the warehouse would be swarming with law enforcement. The father knew he had to act quickly. As he secured the broker with a pair of handcuffs, the man let out a bitter laugh. "You think this ends with me?" he sneered. "There are others, more powerful than you can imagine. This isn't over." The father stepped back, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe not," he said, "but you won't be hurting anyone else." When the officers arrived, the scene was chaotic. Operatives surrendered or fled, the warehouse a testament to the violence that had unfolded. The father handed the broker over to the authorities, ensuring the man was taken into custody without incident. As the dust began to settle, his ally approached, a faint smile on their face. "You did good," they said. "Not many would have had the guts to take this all the way." The father nodded, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "It wasn't just about guts," he said. "It was about doing what's right. For my daughter. For everyone they've hurt." Later, as the first rays of dawn broke over the city, the father stood outside the hospital where his daughter was recovering. She was safe now, her innocence preserved despite the storm that had surrounded her. He watched her through the glass, her peaceful expression a stark contrast to the chaos he had endured. Inside, she opened her eyes and saw him standing there. A smile spread across her face, and he felt a weight lift from his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe, to hope. The broker's arrest sent shockwaves through the city, sparking investigations that uncovered the corruption and conspiracy he had orchestrated. Names were named, deals were exposed, and the foundation of his empire began to crumble. The father knew it wouldn't fix everything. There would always be those who sought power at any cost, but it was a step in the right direction. Months later, he returned to his quiet life, determined to rebuild what had been nearly destroyed. His daughter, stronger than ever, became his anchor, her resilience a reminder of why he had fought so hard. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, she turned to him and asked, "Dad, do you think they'll ever stop people like him?" He thought for a moment, the weight of her question sinking in. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this. We can't stop fighting for what's right. As long as there are people willing to stand up, there's hope." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The battle had been hard, the cost high, but the love and strength they shared had carried them through. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, he knew they would face whatever came next together, unshaken and unafraid.